Hello everybody. My name is Andrew Stolte, and I'm the QuakeCoRE Tech Platform 2 research engineer. And it is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Hamish Avery, the Chief Technical Officer at Canterbury Seismic Instruments and Sentinel. During his PhD at the University of Canterbury, Hamish developed the initial strong motion oscillograph technology platform that was commercialized with Canterbury Seismic Instruments. These instruments were then deployed in the CanNet, a network of instruments in the Canterbury region, which were later subsumed into the nationwide GeoNet. The CanNet instruments recorded the strong motion station here during the Canterbury earthquake sequence. CSI instruments have also been used for all of the buildings in the GeoNet monitoring program. There's been a strong historical link between the University of Canterbury and Canterbury Seismic Instruments, which has led to a continual interaction on research undertaken by universities across the country. A recent example is an ongoing QuakeCoRE outreach project where CSI is facilitating the provision of seismometers in schools throughout the South Island. And they've been doing a lot of cool things recently with a high density network of seismographs, and I'm looking forward to hearing Hamish talk more about this. Thank you for joining us.
Kia koutou, and thanks for the introduction, Andrew, and thanks everyone for your time this morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Hamish Avery, and my formal role is CTO at Canterbury Seismic. But in a company of our size, this really means doing a bit of everything, and one of my more enjoyable parts is being involved with the research side and interfacing with the likes of QuakeCoRE. So I'm delighted to be here and value the opportunity to share what we're up to. I took a very leisurely 13-year path through university, first through physics and then engineering, where I picked as my final year project something I thought would be a good summer job installing seismographs in the mountains. I ended up alone in a windowless office below the plant room in civil engineering, racing to make the first internet native seismograph instead. I don't know that we won, but we were certainly at the genesis of modern seismic sensor design, and it might have even been a draw. This turned into a long and interesting PhD project for me, and that led to the formation of CSI to commercialize one of the outcomes of my research. Right here at the start of the timeline, we can see is John Beryl. He's proudly holding the first unit of the production line, and that unit went on to be part of CanNet, as Andrew mentioned, and had a long and successful life out on the Canterbury Plains. Our original purpose was to commercially produce seismographs for GeoNet, and our equipment now underpins about half of the strong motion network in GeoNet, and the entirety of the GeoNet building instrumentation program. Aside from our continued relationship with GeoNet and other research institutes and QuakeCoRE as well, as Andrew mentioned, over the years we've really found an increasing demand for helping people to understand and best react to the earthquakes that happen to them. Our first major success with this was at Christchurch Airport, where on their part they introduced new procedures, and from our part we provided them with real-time seismic information. And those two things combined meant that since they put that station in following the Dartfield quake, they've not had to close the runway once since then. From there, we now monitor much of our critical infrastructure here in Aotearoa. For example, our major ports, airports, stadiums and hospitals, and even dams. Internationally, we've provided equipment to other national network providers, as well as for infrastructure such as hospitals, bridges and dams throughout Europe and Asia. We're partnered with BSSL, who you might be familiar with from Auckland, Quincy and Liam and Co, to provide the really high-end sophisticated structural health monitoring services. But what I want to talk to you today about is EQRNet and Sentinel. These two names really sort of break down the two components of what we've done. EQRNet itself is a string of dense seismograph networks located through our urban areas, and these generate detailed shaking maps for each earthquake we experience, which are then fed into Sentinel, which is the processing system that converts the information into information about how it's affected our cities and the infrastructure within them. the objective of this really is to help people make better decisions following an earthquake from a city management perspective, through to reducing business interruption, through to what to do as an individual. This is something we've done ourselves. We tried initially to do this as part of a public sector project, but for a whole lot of reasons that didn't progress. So as a business, we offer this as a commercial service, and we need to do that to recover our investment in the networks and to continue developing and maintaining the networks and the systems that deliver this information. Before I go into this too much further, I'll take a brief aside for those of you who are not structural engineers, and myself included in that. So for those of you that are, please bear with us, or perhaps even go and snatch a cookie or something. When people talk about earthquakes and their effects, they often talk about McCall intensity or Richter scales, or perhaps even peak ground acceleration, or PGA. You will have also heard rules of thumb for managing earthquakes, such as, oh, we'll evacuate if there's a magnitude 5 within 50 kilometres. However, none of these terms or rules really relate to how a building is affected by an earthquake. Very crudely, what damages buildings is the amplitude of the shaking and the number of cycles at a frequency called the building's natural frequency, which is broadly related to how tall it is. In other words, how a particular earthquake starts the building swaying. Nearby earthquakes that produce short, sharp shaking generally affect the smaller buildings, whereas distant, larger earthquakes result in a slower rocking, which excites the taller buildings into swaying. For those of us that felt the QuakeCoRE quake here in Christchurch or in Wellington, you'll recall exactly how different that earthquake felt to us, a much longer, slower rocking. When engineers design buildings, they need to be sufficiently strong to resist the damage from certain anticipated shaking levels, which depends on a range of things, but these include things like local soil conditions and seismic risk, and the intended purpose. For example, a hospital has to be much stronger than, say, a hair salon, which I'm kind of in need of. These requirements are given in terms of a series of loading curves in the New Zealand Standard. We can convert earthquake records to directly compare these, the shaking to these standards, which gives us a much better impression of how likely the building is to have suffered damage. And it's really a key aspect of how a system works. It moves away from Richter scale or McCall intensity or PGA. And you can see some of these curves here in this plot we're looking at now. This, I don't know if you can see my mouse here. This lower curve here is the shaking limit above which non-structural damage may occur, such as damage to partition walls or ceiling tiles or water supply. And the upper curve is the point at which you would expect to start to see some structural damage. Typically a building, you can think of it as a building being out of service if it exceeds the lower curve, and perhaps even unsafe if it exceeds the upper curve. In this case, in this particular earthquake we can see here in red or blue, and this curve here is the 100% code curve for a new building at this location. We can see that it was actually quite a bit above the point at which we'd start to see structural damage, but only in one area along this lower axis here. And this lower axis relates broadly to the height of the building. So the taller buildings are out this end of the curve, and the shorter buildings at this end. And if we know where our particular building lies along this lower axis, we can actually see much better what the shaking or how the shaking has affected the building. In this case, we could see that mid-rise buildings would have been mostly affected by this particular quake here. However, when we look at the service limit here, we can see that most buildings in this area would have been had some sort of interior or non-structural damage. This type of analysis is called response spectrum analysis, and if you're interested, I believe this record came from the QuakeCoRE quake as experienced in Wellington. So with that behind us, hopefully this slide here makes a bit more sense. And I'd like to talk a bit about why we created EQRNet and Sentinel. I know this might sound a bit bold or perhaps even arrogant, but it was almost accidental. But later we realized that during the Kaikoura quake, we actually had better information than the decision makers both in Wellington and Christchurch for those following minutes and hours after the quake. There were three reasons for this. Firstly, we had quite a number of our own sensors in buildings in Wellington and in Christchurch. The second reason was that we had access to the GeoNet data and processes in place to convert it into that response spectrum curves. And finally, we were quite used to looking at data from many places in this way. So individually, none of these things were unique. But when we put these things, three things together, that we had more data than anyone else, and we're looking at it in the right way, we realized that we actually had a better image of what was happening straight after the quake than the people making the decisions. And it presented a really quite compelling image of what the likely effects were in Wellington and Christchurch. So this graph, this slide here shows a summary of what we knew from the Wellington CBD straight after the quake. And we've taken out all of our sites, so for commercial reasons, but confidentiality reasons. But even from this this reduced data set, we can actually see there are some areas that exceeded design code limits, even for new buildings of particular height classes, and that some nearby areas didn't. So we could also take from this that there would have been some buildings that experienced structural damage in some areas, and given that most of the buildings in Wellington weren't at 100% of the current code, then that was likely to be perhaps worse than what we might have first thought. But a key thing that was missing was that we had no idea what was happening between the known points. For instance, here along the waterfront, no one had any sensors, but we could see between, these two sites, for example, or the sites that are circled, that the variation was quite big, even over small distances. So it left a lot of questions unanswered, as much as it told a story of a city that would have suffered some considerable damage to many of its buildings. It took a long time for that full picture to come out and for all the buildings to be evacuated and demolished or strengthened. And in that time, some people did some really good work developing things such as the rapid spectra from GeoNet, or GNS, and also some of the work that QuakeCoRE was doing on better procedures for inspecting buildings, for example. But the fact remained that there was still a lot of information that was missing in that immediate aftermath of the earthquake. And that's really quite vital when we're deciding about what we do as far as red zones go. Are we business as usual the next day, or do we need to close a whole lot of buildings? So if you can excuse this cheesy animation, this is what we did. And perhaps you might see that this is a greatly exaggerated earthquake. I think it tells more about my abilities with animation software. Sorry, it seems an embarrassingly long silence there. So putting that into a more diagrammatic view, our vision was to install masses of our own sensors in the cities and combine them with data from other available sources, such as the GeoNet dataset, and then take that information and convert it into useful, easily understood decision-making information, and then deliver it really to the, and this is really the key thing, deliver it to the right people in the right way immediately. By measuring all these points very close together, we can capture a complete set of ground shaking information without all those big gaps we saw in Wellington in the couple of slides back. We then take that data and process it and convert it into a range of formats, such as what the shaking looked like relative to the New Zealand Building Code, or for instance, what the shaking looked like in terms of ground movement. If we take that information, we can compare it to assets within the network and just determine quickly how bad the shaking was relative to preset limits for each building. And then, as I said earlier, the vital step is sending that information to the right people in a way that they understand it. But a key thing to that is having them prepared for that, so they know what the information is going to look like and how to interpret it and what it's actually telling them. I think that's really important. And for me, one of the things that was, I guess, alarmed me the most was that people were driving past all these sensors in Wellington and Christchurch to make decisions, and there was this information sitting there, or this data sitting there, and no one even knew it was there until much later. So for those that like gadgets, this is what the sensors look like. These are relatively low cost to install and operate. We use existing infrastructure where we can to house them because it again reduces the cost. We use the cellular network for the communications, which greatly streamlines the communications aspect because we only have a few providers to manage, and that in the past has been a real problem. Perhaps the bulk of our work when we're installing stuff is dealing with IT teams and trying to keep track of various networks. And I know someone's going to ask, so I'll jump ahead on that. Why we use the cellular system? And the answer to that is that it's been proven to be the most reliable of all the options, except for satellite, which is prohibitively expensive. And the reason for that is the cellular network consists of like a self-healing mesh of towers, and each of those has got its own battery backup. And for those that might rebut that following the Christchurch quakes that their phone calls and texts weren't going through, at the same time, the GeoNet system had almost perfect reliability because it was the sort of data channels that were entirely free. So the cell companies, they optimize their bandwidth so that we can all watch Netflix and YouTube on our phones. And they're not really expecting or preparing for sudden huge leaps in text and cellular phone calls. So that data channel is entirely free during the aftermath of large events. So something that we worked out is that we're actually better off to Skype or Zoom our families after a big quake because the phone messages often don't go through. Most of our sensors are installed in the as close to free field locations as we can get in the urban environment, and they're traffic signals cabinets, which you've probably never seen them, but once you've seen them, you see them everywhere. So every street corner that's got traffic signals on it has a little grey cabinet off to one corner. And we did some testing on these and found that they've got a concrete, you can see it over in the bottom here, there's a concrete ring set below the ground, which we can mount our sensor in. And then it's got a lightweight cabinet above it with power and plenty of space. And we did a lot of testing on these and found that that lightweight tower produced no measurable interference in the areas of interest for us for the seismic signals. In other locations, such as pools or pumping facilities and that, we just install them on the ground and put a little cover over them. So initially we started with 10 sensors in Christchurch to see how this would look. And this really confirmed what we saw in Wellington in the earlier slide, that there are indeed big variations over short distances. And you'll notice the large peak in the centre of the image. That's at the cathedral. And we can see that at that point, the shaking was 23% of the ultimate limit state, which was probably not far off where the state of the cathedral at the time. And initially we thought, oh, this has got to be a sensor fault or something else going on. But we did a lot of testing and found that this was actually genuine. And in the following quakes that we captured, we saw that this pattern was different. There were other points that had higher shaking than others, and the cathedral one dropped back a bit. And this seems to be the rule, that each quake is indeed very different. And on the back of this work, Christchurch City Council and the Smart Cities program decided to invest in us and help us to roll out the first dense network. And this is what it looks like now in Christchurch. Well, a subset of that. In the centre there, we've got the CBD, but there are over 200 sensors now spread across the city and right across even as far as the peninsula. But you'll see that really we've focused on the CBD area, and the greatest concentrations are where people live and work, and where the financial investment is. About 200 metres spacing. The blue dots are the GeoNet sites that we incorporate as well. We can't really rely on them because we don't have much say in their operational status or how the communication works, but they certainly are a useful addition. So since that first earthquake, we've had plenty more. And here's some of the last 12 months earthquakes. And the area we're looking at here is pretty much just the CBD. The key thing really to see is that each earthquake is indeed different. And while we've identified some areas that seem to generally have larger amplitude than others, this isn't really something we can state with great confidence yet. And I think this is probably a very interesting research topic. And again, we've got the same thing in peak ground acceleration, where we tend to see a stronger variation. I should mention too that the previous slide was in terms of the New Zealand standard loading curve at 1 Hertz. And then again, we've got the same thing for ground displacement. And actually, I think we're running a bit short on time, so I'll flick through that. So what do some of these outputs look like? And how do we use this information? So the first thing we do is that we collect it all from all the sensors, and then we convert it into heat maps of different metrics. And a couple of examples are given here from a quake in July last year, quite close to the city. To the left, we have a heat map that shows the shaking levels relative to the New Zealand Building Code across the city. And to the right, we have a heat map that shows the ground movement. And that's really of use to infrastructure managers looking at things like water supply or electrical networks or telecommunications networks. And it's quite interesting to see that for this particular earthquake, the areas where we had the greatest shaking in terms of that would affect buildings, it didn't occur in the same place as where we would where we saw the largest ground movements. And this is something we're really keen to see how this pattern, well, what we can understand from this as the events get larger and we capture more of them. And there's a range of other ways we can look at this data you can see down the left here. This information we deliver directly to Civil Defence in Christchurch and to the utilities teams in council. The vision is that these will be able to be used to direct USAR teams to hotspots, to work out how they can manage the roading networks, where they should be closing roads, and where they should be cutting water, or how to reroute power or communications. Once we have the heat maps, we can then put on top of them information that we know about buildings. So we can say at any point the shaking is this relative to code, and this particular asset or building has this design capacity and it has a natural period here. And then we can tell as a first pass sort of answer what the likely damage is or what the risk is for that particular building. You know, is it a small earthquake here? Can we just keep operating, or are we justified in evacuating and triggering a business interruption insurance claim, or do we need to keep out of this building? And we push this information to the different people involved in the building, like the building manager will get just a simple message saying, you know, the shaking's quite low, you can keep working, or you should get out. And to the engineers, we send more detailed information, including information about the shaking and the response spectra for that particular building and that event. And this goes out via app or email or text or through a web portal. We acknowledge that this isn't a perfect solution. There are assumptions. It's a feed-forward system with the assumption that the building will perform as it's designed. But I think the key thing is that compared to the cost and engineering investment for something much more complicated that's going to give a better answer, or compared to the risk of using a distant magnitude of the event, we think it represents excellent value. It provides much more certainty than using that magnitude and distance, but it's vastly cheaper than a comprehensive structural monitoring system. But you know, and also for a definitive answer about the building state, we don't ever intend for this to replace detailed engineering inspections. We think it's very complementary. What we think it will do is provide confidence that when the engineer inspecting the building has a look at it, that if they see that the shaking's been severe but they don't see damage, that they can look further and be justified in spending more money to pull back more carpets and that, looking for damage. Or on the other hand, if it looks okay and the shaking's low, they can be confident that what they see is correct. And then to the public, we provide low resolution maps in terms of McCall intensity. And we chose McCall because we believe it's a measure that the general public is familiar with and is most relevant to how they might want to act. For example, seeing that your parents living in an area where the shaking is severe and your children are living in an area where the shaking was light, it makes it very clear who you should help first and where you should go. We've also tried to avoid releasing public data that could be used for asset management. Part of that's to protect our value, but also is to prevent it being used in an unsafe manner. One of the things that keeps getting asked us is, how does this relate to GeoNet? And I'd like to emphatically say that we see this as being entirely complementary to GeoNet and vice versa. I think that when we look at the origins of each organisation, while there's a lot of commonality in what we do, the motivation and focus is really quite different. And we think that the two missions dovetail nicely to improve our seismic resilience in Aotearoa. We try to be very conscious of our messaging around this. I realise there's been a few clumsy things said that have caused a bit of upset. But while we strongly discourage the use of the magnitude and distance paradigm to make decisions on, this isn't in any way related to any feelings we have about the work GeoNet and GNS have done to provide earthquake information. And we know and appreciate that a lot of this was done by people working through the night to deliver information to us throughout the earthquake sequences. We're also appreciate and are grateful to the free access for the free access to the GeoNet network. So in short, we're really supportive and closely aligned to the GeoNet program itself, but are concerned about the method that's been widely adopted of using that information in a way that it wasn't really intended. And I think that you can, that this image really supports my points on the last slide, where you can see the differences in our missions. Our sense is we've roughly got a similar amount of sensors, GeoNet and EQRNet, but really you can see where we've focused our installations, and that's in the urban areas, whereas the GeoNet network's been really deployed for maximum event capture and geographic coverage, so that we can understand the seismicity of our country and the risks we face. So when we started our journey to develop this, we really had quite a narrow focus on what we were trying to achieve. And that was for better outcomes for our city managers and for civil defence following big quakes. You know, smaller focus red zones, less risk of missing damaged buildings, and so on. As our journey evolved and our initial idea to do this in conjunction with a lot of other organisations didn't progress, we found that we were having to do this alone, and as a commercial company, we changed our focus to commercial targets. But over the time we've been doing this, we've really realised that there's a much wider range of benefits to a wider range of stakeholders than what we first envisaged. And when we started to think about how our system looked through both societal and commercial lenses, we understood that there was really quite a big mismatch between the commercial drivers and the societal benefit. And the commercial incentives aren't really motivating us to deliver that maximum societal benefits. But on the other hand, that conflicts with our initial motivation to do better things. So I think one of our major challenges at the moment is about how we could try and resolve this conflict. And on a personal level, it feels very uncomfortable to hold a increasingly rich and useful data set. You know, when I'm getting emails from people saying, "Oh, can we have a look?" And you know, it's something I'd really love to be able to freely hand out, but you know, that's where our value in our company is, and it's quite a challenge. So that's definitely something we're looking at. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'd like to thank you again for your time. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on what we're doing, critique or positive or just curious. I'm also really happy to talk individually if anyone wants to dive a little bit deeper into this. You can reach me by looking up Sentinel or CSI. We're not really shy about what we're doing. You know, nothing here is really new or unique. It's really just a bigger scale application of well understood basic engineering. We also have an app that we're looking for people to use and abuse and give us feedback on. And for you, you might just get an alert before you feel a quake. Yeah, it's sort of a unexpected consequence of this, that we're often delivering alerts before we feel them. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hamish, for an excellent presentation. Let's open the floor to questions. Feel free to sing out. Just be sure to unmute yourself before you ask the question.
Hi, Andrew. I'm going to kick out here. Hey, Hamish, that was really interesting. The sort of internal network you've got is much bigger than I'd sort of realized. I guess my question for you is coming back to that project we were talking about in terms of trying to put down downhole sensors, and whether there's a possibility to hook in other instruments to existing sensors within your network.
Sorry, to be able to incorporate new sensors into EQRNet, or the other way around?
Well, so what I'm getting at is if we were to put down borehole sensors, we would always want to have a surface instrument.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And so the question is, you know, can you basically feed in additional signals into the hardware that you have on surface to try and reduce some of the additional hardware we would need to put those things in the ground?
Yeah, look, absolutely. One of the things that we've really done with right from the start is that we've really tried to use open standards so that we can incorporate bidirectionally any other sensor that uses the open standards that exist for data transfer for seismic data. So yeah, absolutely.
Hi, Hamish. Mark
Hi.
Sterling here from Otago University. We've been in touch with you guys regarding getting instruments installed at the university. Unlike the other Otago campuses, the Dunedin campus is quite vast, and funding restrictions mean we can't put instruments densely across the campus. Now, today's presentation was really useful for me to be reminded as to why we're doing this and what we will get out of it in basically real time. Given the funding restrictions, we have been looking at just putting one instrument per site class around the campuses, 4 or 5 site classes that we've mapped through a student of mine. Can you comment on what, whether we are really selling ourselves short in that respect, or whether non-zero is better than zero in terms of the information that we'll get if we get response from say one building per site class rather than a distribution across the site classes?
Yeah, so
a bit of a curly one, but it's really current right now as I seek funding from my employer.
No, look, that's absolutely a very good question. It touches on something that we don't actually have a good answer for yet, and that is what is the minimum spacing you need to have the sensors at. So we've hedged our bets here a bit. We've done it by putting sensors very close together or in specific points of interest. I guess the short answer is we would recommend 100 to 200 meters minimum spacing plus site class at the moment, and this is something that we're hoping to kick off a research project on. We're talking with the university now about what that minimum spacing might actually look like. But at the moment, in the absence of a really good answer there, our recommendation would be every couple of 100 meters and/or plus site class differences if you know they exist.
Sure.
But certainly it's having a few sensors around campus is much better than none.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, I guess we have, by doing the limited number of sensors with respect to site class, we have to have confidence in our site class mapping. And the implicit assumption is that you won't get huge differences in the amplification within those site classes, and that's admittedly a very dangerous assumption.
Well, I think so too. And it's too early to say for us, but what we're seeing as preliminary results is that the shaking is very non-uniform, even over consistent site classes.
Right. Yeah.
So really, it's that spacing is the critical one. Yeah.
Thanks. That's really useful.
Hi, Hamish. There was a question in the Zoom chat asking about how does the public access the shaking maps? Do they have to sign up for your app, or can you just describe that process?
Yeah, they can. Or there's a public portal. Unfortunately, it's down today. We're releasing it on Wednesday next week. It's been there for the last few months, and we've taken it down for the last week. If you want to check Sentinel, sentinel.net.nz Wednesday, it'll be back there. So, and that gives you a back catalogue of roughly 12 months of shaking for our main centres.
Perfect, thanks.
Hey, sorry, Mark Stringer here again from University of Canterbury. I guess one of the questions is how much does the access to the Sentinel data cost?
Yeah. Okay. So we do it as a service. So it's roughly, well, no, it's not roughly. It's $200 per building per month.
Per building per month. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So effectively, we priced it to be similar to buying your own instrument over time, but with a whole lot of other benefits, such as us monitoring it, managing it.
Yeah, cool, thank you.
Kia ora, Hamish. It's Nick Horsfall here from GNS.
Okay, Nick.
Great talk, and yeah, great to see sort of some of the details of the network. We've talked a little bit about this, but just wondering if you can comment on if you guys have an engagement plan with researchers, and obviously you've said there's a lot of questions could be explored with this kind of data, the density we haven't seen in New Zealand before. So do you have a recommended approach for how researchers can potentially collaborate or access the data? Is just your thoughts on that?
Yeah, as I said on that last slide, that's really our challenge at the moment. No, we don't at the moment, and it weighs heavily on me on a personal level. Ultimately, what we'd like is some mechanism where some entity could fund us to provide it open access for research. That would be the ultimate goal. Well, no, take a step back further. Ultimately, this would be best in the public arena. The whole lot, free open data access for everyone, every building owner. That would make me very happy. In the interim, though, really it would either be a case-by-case basis, or some entity such as EQC funding the data for research. But we don't have a good answer right now. But happy to talk.
Thanks.
Hamish, have you thought about models where basically a bit like the NZGD, if someone basically buys an instrument and puts it into the network, then it gives access to the rest of the network?
Yes, and that's the way it works for some of our clients. Some people, just due to procurement rules, need to buy and own the asset. So that they basically, it works that if you buy one and feed it into the network, that benefits everyone around you. If yours fails, then all the sensors around you will fill in the blank for you. So that works really well.
Well, thank you very much, Hamish, for an excellent presentation. It's exciting to hear about the development of this network.
No, you're very welcome, and thanks again for the opportunity.
At this time, if there are no other questions, I'd like to call the seminar to a close. And I'd like to remind you that next month, our seminar will be on the 12th, and I will be speaking about improving our understanding of sedimentary basins through regional site investigation studies. Thank you all.